Hello, everybody. This is Exennial Thought, and I want to talk about my thoughts on hunting. So, I don't know if there's any hunters out there who might tune in to one of these videos, but I just say in general, I'm an advocate for hunting. I've been out a few times, and I think it is a really cool experience. Now, there's a good way to hunt, and there's a bad way to hunt, obviously, and so you want to know the difference. So I'm not an expert by any means, but I have been out a few times. And matter of fact, I used to live in western Montana, and I lived with some guys who were pretty deep into hunting. And during the hunting season, they would go out. It seems like almost every weekend, and they would hunt for pronghorn. I think they went down to like different part of Montana or Wyoming, and they shot a bunch of pronghorn, or a couple anyway. Mule deer hunting, whitetail. They'd even go for bear. I think they've tried to get bighorn sheep tags unsuccessfully because it's usually a lottery and it's hard to get. And they also hunted rabbits. They hunted, um, like I said, I don't think they ever hunted grizzly, but they did hunt black bear and pheasant. They did bird hunting as well. And so there's a shack in the back of this house that we all lived in. There's me and three other guys. And I know during the winter I'd go back in there and there'd just be like, a whole bunch of animals just hanging there and um, just draining the blood's draining, or there would be heads and stuff in there. It's like murder on a Sunday afternoon, but that's part of it. Like hunting is, for people who aren't accustomed to it or haven't seen it a lot, it can appear graphic, but make no mistake, that's how we've gotten our food, or that's how we've fed our families and nourished ourselves for, well, forever, before really the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you can say the Agricultural Revolution, but people were still hunting a fair amount then. There was plenty of hunter-gatherer societies during the agricultural revolutions around the planet. And it's really only been in the last couple hundred years, I think, with the Industrial Revolution and mass agriculture, which has been facilitated by the Industrial Revolution, where you see that hunting isn't been so mainstream. Although there are plenty of hunters still, especially in the U.S. But yeah, I got to go on some really cool trips with these guys in Montana, and so I would just kind of tag along. At the time, I wasn't hunting, and in hindsight, I probably should have gotten a tag and a license, but I'd just tag along with binoculars and a backpack full of food, and we would just get out there. And so I'd hang out with those guys in the tree stands and just wait for deer to walk under, if they were bow hunting, because they did bow hunting and rifle. And I went out on a couple of elk hunting expeditions with a bow with one of my good buddies. And so we'd hike up in the Rattlesnake Wilderness and then some of the mountains around there. And they would use bugles to call in elk, which is pretty amazing. So there's a technique to it and there's some practice, but you basically use a male bugle during the rutting season, which is when the elk are, it's basically their mating season. The male elk will bugle call, and they'll fight off other males and try and find a female to mate with. And so they have this really distinct kind of bugle call. I can't even really do it. You'd have to hear like a bugle call, an artificial one, or go online and watch an elk actually call in. And then and then a female makes an ewe call once a male gets close, and they'll call in a male. And so as a hunter, what you do is you basically just hunt up or hike up into the hills or the mountains in full camo with your bow, and you just get to a point where you want to bugle where you think elk might be. You might hear them in the distance bugling. So you bugle with your artificial bugle. It's this big long tube. You try and call them in, because sometimes they'll come in and look for a fight. And then once they get close, you'll use the ewe call, which is the female call, and it's a lot softer. It's almost like a buzz, like buzz, buzz. And then once you get a clean shot of a male, you try and take him out with a bow. And I think typically you need to get within under 60 yards. You need to get pretty close. And so that's what's really scary, is that these things, if you get in their way, they can do some serious damage. I think they usually get pretty skittish and run off if they see a person or smell something funny. But nonetheless, they're large animals. Fully grown male elk, I think, you get up to 700-800 pounds at least. And so yeah, you need to get within probably 60 yards or less. Ideally, you want to be about 40 yards. I think Cameron Haynes and some of these guys who get bows that are really stringed really tight, they can, with some practice, you can get up to like accurate up to 90 or 100 yards. But I think for most people, it's under 60. So I went out on a couple experiences, a couple expeditions with these guys up in the hills, and it's pretty fantastic. It's also easy to get lost up in the mountains. So once you get lost and you don't know where the dirt road is that you drove in on or the trail you walked in on, it's really important to have a GPS. You want to have a reliable GPS, and you want to make sure it's connected up. So if you ever get lost in the backwoods and the weather turns or it starts to get dark and you don't know where the hell you are, you want to make sure you're able to walk out. So you always want to make sure you have some little bit of survival gear, some extra food just in case everything goes bad. But typically you don't want to go out there and spend the night if you're just going to day hunt, unless that's your whole trip is spending a few nights out there, which some hunters do as well. And so, yeah, one time we went out and we were up in the Rattlesnake Wilderness or whereabouts, and yeah, we called in a male pretty close, and I think it started bugling near us within probably 100 or 200 yards, but it was so thick. So this is like really thick coniferous trees and overgrowth, and you can't really see very far, and so we never got a look at him. And at one point we hiked out. Another trip I went on that was really cool because I went up with a couple of my buddies, and two of them were my roommates at the time, and we hiked up in the Cabinet Wilderness, which is kind of northwestern Montana, and it's just mountains. And so basically we hiked up in these mountains, and this was an overnight trip, and I think we spent 2 nights out there, so 3 days, 2 nights. And so these guys were going after large mule deer, and so the 3 of them had rifles, and I just hiked up in there with binoculars and just a smile on my face, and yeah, we got right up in these mountains, and then I think the second night one of the guys got a large mule deer and took one down, and then actually the same day, I think the same day, the second day, 2 of the guys both got mule deer, and I didn't see the shot. I basically the second day I hiked up on this ridge that was about 15 or 20 feet away from this 300-foot cliff, and it was basically in between these 2 mountains where this ridge was. And I set up camp there. So I just hiked up there and I made a fire and I set up my tent. And, those guys who were out looking for deer just up in the mountains, they basically said, yeah, set up a fire, set up the tent, get a spot for us. So when we come back in, we got the fire going, that would be awesome. So I said, sure, no problem. So basically we camped out next to this 300-foot cliff up in the mountains. And they told me later that they got a couple deer. And so they gutted them. And then they wanted to go hike and basically quarter them and get the meat and then hike out. Because, I mean, when you're way up in the mountains, and if the deer's too big or the animal's too big, you really can't hike it out. I mean, if it's 300-400 pounds, there's no way. You can't drag it. So with a small white-tailed deer, if you're close enough to your car, you can usually just drag it out or throw it over your back. But if it's a large mule deer, or like especially an elk, you can't do that unless you have an ATV or you have your truck nearby and you can drag it or something. But normally what you do is you gut it in the field or out in the mountains, and then you quarter it, or you just cut up the meat and you throw it in a game bag and you hike out as much as you can or all of it. And so the third day, that's what we did. So we hiked back down to this, after we camped up on this ridge. We hiked back down into kind of an area where we could get back up at these deer. And then we hiked another few miles up into these mountains, and then where the deer had been shot. And then we just quartered them all up. And between the 4 of us, we just hiked them all out another, 5 or 6 miles back to our cars. And then that was it. That was a trip. But it was epic. Like, it was a really cool trip. And at the time, I was pretty, I don't know, I just had a different attitude about things. I think at that time in Montana, I was more of, when I first moved to Montana, I think in general, I was just a little more kind of bleeding heart. I was kind of unsure about hunting, and I was unsure about that kind of stuff. But living with those guys and hearing their stories and hearing what it takes to do that and what it means, getting your own meat, and how empowering it is to get wholesome, fresh food out in nature and doing it cleanly and doing it legally. And then hiking it all out, it's really empowering. It's not only empowering, but it's really nourishing. It's high quality meat, and you just can't get that experience really anywhere else unless you do it. And so since then, since those experiences in Montana, a few years later, I went out a few times bow hunting up in kind of northern Washington near the Canadian border. And I've also gone out rifle hunting a few times, unsuccessful so far. Although I did take a shot at a deer with my bow once and I missed it because I'm a shit shot right now. But yeah, it was really cool. So